Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Gramm-Rudman, two words that strike fear in the hearts of bureaucrats everywhere. It's a deficit reduction program that mandates reducing the federal deficit this year to a mere $144 billion. The Reagan administration is proposing closing the deficit, reducing the deficit by cutting domestic expenditures. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll look at the political viability of such a proposal. We'll look at whether a tax increase is perhaps inevitable at the federal or state levels, and what are the implications for Indiana. Discussing this today on Public Affairs Roundtable are our panelists, Matthias Mittman from Ball State's Department of Economics, Cecil Bohannon from the Department of Economics here at Ball State University, and Bruce Galehood from the Department of History. Matthias, tell us something about Gramm-Rudman. What are the mechanics of it?
The mechanics of the bill are fairly simple. What it mandates is that at the beginning of the year, the President submits his budget proposal to the Congress. The Congress has in the spring to either revise and alter the President's budget or come up with a budget of their own. By the end of the summer, the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget reviews the final budget package that's been prepared by the Congress. They make a recommendation to the General Accounting Office, which is a member of the executive branch of government, and the General Accounting Office then submits a report to the President stating whether or not the proposed budget will exceed the deficit limits as specified by Gramm-Rudman, $144 billion in fiscal year 1987. If it exceeds that, then President Reagan orders mandatory reductions in domestic spending by the proposed or by the enacted limits in the bill, and those take effect October 15th.
One syndicated newspaper columnist called Gramm-Rudman a bad idea whose time has come. What's he mean by that?
What he means by that is that the budget and appropriations process in the Congress has gotten exceedingly out of control, and that Congress hasn't been able to come up with the willpower or the discipline to impose responsible spending programs on themselves, and that the budget process has gotten out of control, that this is a last resort method of attempting to force them to cut spending where they don't have the self-discipline to do it themselves.
Well, I wonder about the following. Gramm-Rudman has been said to be a very bad bill that may have some very good results. And could it be that the fact that Gramm-Rudman is such a bad bill, that in and of itself might impose a discipline on Congress to make them do some things that they wouldn't do otherwise? A lot of stories have come out talking about the evils of the across-the-board cuts, that in particular agencies, you don't want to cut all programs by the same amount. I mean, that's just absurd. There's no particular reason to believe that. To the extent it is such a bad bill, maybe that's the thing that will force Congress to do things. Maybe it's such a stick that that will force Congress to balance the budget one way or another.
That has been the intent of at least Senator Gramm, who has stated that he wants to force Congress to make the cuts, and that the ideal is that Gramm-Rudman would never be enacted. The bill, in many people's eyes, is so bad because of these mandatory across-the-board type cuts that's worse than anything Congress could do, and as a result of that incentive, Congress will make the cuts that are the most beneficial or the least damaging to the economy.
So the more we hate it, the more we love it. That's
right.
The whole idea behind Gramm-Rudman, this pleasure in pain or something like that.
Not only perhaps is it faulty from that arbitrary standpoint, but apparently it might be faulty constitutionally. There is a court case, a lower court, I believe, has found it, in fact, to be unconstitutional, but Gramm-Rudman will stay in effect until the Supreme Court rules on it. What is that ruling? What's that say?
The ruling says, as I understand it, that Congress can only mandate these appropriations expenditures, and that the Gramm-Rudman gives that power to the General Accounting Office, which is not a office that's again overseen by Congress, but it's a member of the executive branch, and that would enable, again, the executive branch through the President, through the GAO, to set these budget cuts into effect. And that Congress doesn't constitutionally have the power to give up its right to determine appropriations and spending.
are we in fact going to start looking toward a tax increase at some level?
Larry, I think you're asking a political question now as well as an economic question.
Sure.
Some of us in Indiana, I suspect, are familiar with this recent study that was published by a Washington-based organization trying to explain what the full extent of Gramm-Rudman would be on state budgets. Indiana was presumed to would lose something on the order of $241 million as a result of Gramm-Rudman enacted cuts or Gramm-Rudman mandated cuts. What the authors of this study then imply, I suspect, is that if that were the case, then Indiana would lose its surplus of some $217 million and would have to enact a tax increase to make up the difference between that and the federal shortfall, so to speak. If you believe that figure, or if you believe that study is valid, then I think you could probably go down the road and say, yes, at Indiana, if this does indeed happen, we could look at some sort of a general tax levy to make up the difference, because otherwise our state budget would not be balanced, and of course the Constitution of the State of Indiana mandates a balanced budget.
If we wanted to maintain those programs.
That's right. If we wanted to maintain
get
programs in highway and education that essentially these cuts would presumably deal with. What I think politically is at work here is really a much deeper sort of circumstance, and that is the Reagan administration might very well say to a state like Indiana, which has a surplus, why should federal aid come in such great amounts if you have the surplus? Why to have these programs in highways or in education, something like that? Why shouldn't you use some of this surplus to pay for that? Why should you rely on federal funds? Same could be said for other states which have large surpluses, for example. I think as a more practical level, I think Gramm-Rudman would have a negative effect right now on such large states as California, New York, even two of our neighboring states, Michigan and Ohio, according to this study, would be hurt about twice as badly as Indiana. Michigan would have to raise an additional $500 million, same for Ohio, because of Gramm-Rudman related cuts. And I think what the Reagan administration is saying is we're interested in maintaining Social Security, we're interested in maintaining defense, we have to cover the costs of funding the national debt, the interest on the national debt. But a lot of these other programs may indeed have to be picked up by the states if the citizens of the states want these services. And if that means a tax increase or going into a surplus, maybe that's what these states should do. And I think it also is a way perhaps of looking at states like New York, for example, where the Reagan administration believes that certainly the level of services which the state provides is out of proportion to perhaps what it's taxing its own citizens, and maybe forcing a governor like Mario Cuomo to take an unpopular political position in perhaps in a re-election campaign that he has coming up, or even in a possible presidential campaign. So there are a lot of political ramifications.
Depending on what figures you look at, you find Indiana 42nd, 45th, 47th in the amount of dollars they get returned from Washington. We send $1 to Washington, we get 70 cents back.
That's right.
Mississippi sends $1 to Washington, they get $1.23 back.
Right.
Sometimes, I mean, for like that, it would seem that the fewer dollars we send to Washington, the better off we in Indiana are.
Well, again, I think that's something that's got to be crucially brought out with respect to the Washington-based study that Bruce referred to. All it focused on was the fact that Indiana is going to lose $241 million. What it didn't focus on is the obvious point that if Indiana doesn't lose $241 million, what's going to finance that spending? Well, obviously a tax increase. I did a little back-of-the-envelope kind of calculation using some fairly basic statistics, but I think they're revealing. The statistics I found was that for every $1 billion reduction in federal spending, Indiana loses something like $17.5 million in grants, one way or another. I suppose that's not good. On the other hand, a $1 billion tax increase indicates, the statistics I saw would indicate Indiana will end up paying something like $21.5 million in new taxes. So every time we substitute $1 billion in tax decreases, $1 billion in expenditure reductions for $1 billion in tax increases rather, Indiana ends up being $4 million wealthier. So we ought to love Gramm-Rudman. Right. It's right up our alley.
I mean, how many dollars did we send to Washington to get that $241 million back?
And then, of course, the other thing to think about is that if the budget deficit finances government spending, people, or at least some journals, some people tend to think that that money's coming from the tooth fairy one way or another. If there's cost imposed on the state of Indiana if we finance government spending through a budget deficit. So again, comparing those alternatives, it's very clear that expenditure cutbacks are probably the best thing on net for the state of Indiana. that on net they will make us wealthier if Gramm-Rudman goes through and we have across-the-board spending cuts, even if the local governments and the state government at the Indianapolis level doesn't have the same amount of resources they had before from the federal treasury. On net, the state of Indiana is going to gain.
Are we going to see some reaction? We talked politically. Is it viable? Is this going to work?
Well, you know, the people on both sides of this issue will say two different things. I suspect that what the Reagan administration, in not wanting to go for a tax increase and holding out so firmly against one, even I noticed in a recent news conference the president gave, he seemed to even slam the door on the possibility of an oil import fee as a way of possibly lowering the deficit or something like that. It would seem that the Reagan administration's position right now is if Gramm-Rudman is tried, or something like Gramm-Rudman is tried, however the court cases work out, and we move to a balanced budget, federal budget within 5 years, that a tax increase will not be necessary because the government will have essentially worked itself back to a balanced budget position, and then we should be able to sustain that. Now, current spending targets, if the defense buildup were to continue at a certain pace, if domestic cuts were not to take place, I don't know how you could expect to make up that kind of a difference in revenue without some sort of a tax increase, without a Gramm-Rudman kind of mechanism.
Bruce, do you think the president's going to be more flexible on defense cuts than he is on tax increases?
Yes, I do. I think it's been proven in the past that he was. In 1982, for example, when there was a round of tax increases under the guise of user fees and other kinds of things, he was willing to essentially deal with some elements of the defense budget. And again, in 1983, actually postponed, I think, a portion of the raise that were going to go to active uniform military people, or at least not give the amount of the increase that had been earlier proposed. And yes, I do think that it's possible to back off on defense considerably.
Several years ago, David Stockman made a statement to William Grider, the Atlantic Monthly, saying that the marginal tax rate cuts were as a Trojan horse to attempt to reduce total government spending, and they deliberately created large deficits to force Congress to reduce spending. When that didn't work, some people now think that Gramm-Rudman, in an attempt to close those same deficits, are again, that their goal is not to reduce the size of the deficit, but their goal is actually to reduce total government spending. Do you think that's true? And do you think total government spending, the size of total government spending, is really the issue that Gramm-Rudman's concerned with, not the actual size of the deficit? Given that whenever government spends a dollar, it has to raise a dollar either through taxation, direct taxation, borrowing, or financed by printing money.
Yes, Matthias, I think if you go back to the time that David Stockman made that comment to William Grider, this would have been somewhere in 1981, 82, and so forth. And I believe that the Reagan tax cuts, at least the round that were passed in 81 and 82 and so forth, I think they had two purposes. One, to have the stimulative effect that the Reagan administration is so fond of talking about in terms of total economic growth, but also to essentially deprive the government of revenues. And then, in turn, hoping that Congress would essentially say, all right, we can't run monstrous deficits, we have to cut back. And I think Speaker O'Neill was very clear by about mid-1981 that essentially these programs had to continue at certain levels, and the Reagan administration and the Congress, particularly the Democratic-controlled House, haven't been able to resolve that issue. Democrats in the House wanting to maintain programs at a certain level, the Reagan administration not wanting to go for a tax increase, and an overall tax increase in this sense, and willing to tolerate deficits. So I think you have had this stalemate in a sense, and deficits have gotten larger because neither side really has been willing to give on a fundamental philosophic principle.
Sure, and I think that's what it all turns on.
That's at least 5 years old now.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question of what role you want the government to be playing in the lives of the American polity. And even if people do have a consensus that there's certain things we don't think the government ought to do anymore, like run railroads, you have senators like Dan Quayle who are going to protect the jobs in Beech Grove. To the extent that's the case, actually restructuring and rearranging the role of the federal government, I think, is something that's very difficult. And I think that's what we've learned in the last 5 years.
Yes, despite, I think, what the Reagan administration has wanted to do about reducing government.
Right.
Government is now bigger by a substantial margin than it was even 5 years ago.
This is a means toward President Reagan's years-old program of the new federalism?
To an extent. Once again, I think Gramm-Rudman and its effects of federal government revenues as they affect state governments is part of another trend which we've seen going on. Remember in the tax reform bill which was floated out earlier in 1985, the tax reform idea which was floated out in 85, the idea of not allowing the deductibility on federal income tax of state and local income tax levies and that sort of thing. Now that apparently didn't get very far, but again, this was another idea I think that the Reagan administration had, and essentially saying to state governments that, that you may have to raise your taxes to provide the services for your citizens. You can't expect federal taxes to continue to essentially subsidize this. And there's another political ramification of this. A lot of this federal aid to states really took off, ironically enough, in the Nixon administration. General revenue sharing was a Nixon administration idea. And again, the concept was that the federal government would help but not control. Well, I think the Reagan administration apparently has said it's gone farther than that. The states are too dependent on Washington now, and we have to start moving away from this. Gramm-Rudman's one more evidence to cite, I think, a trend which began maybe earlier in the Reagan administration, but certainly began, or certainly was seen last year with the tax reform proposal that was put out.
Well, I think there's certain credence in that, and something like 28% of all state and local spending is financed at the federal level. Now, of course, someone pays for that 28 cents, and of course it's the taxpayers that would pay their funds to the state and local. On average, that has to be true. The money's coming from the same pocket. Nevertheless, I think a lot of people have argued, and there's some empirical evidence to indicate that it is the case, that it gives the voter the perception that the cost of $1 worth of government spending at the local level is only 75 cents. So that it's a subsidy for local spending. What happens? You get more local spending. So you're right, it is consistent with the Ronald Reagan notion of reducing the role of government, or at least making state and local governments pay the full cost associated with engaging in the activity they're engaging in.
It's interesting, the point that you brought out earlier about the dollars that Indiana sends to Washington versus the dollars that Indiana gets back from Washington. This was, I think, one of the reasons why Proposition 13 was able to pass in California in 1978 when it did. The proponents of Proposition 13 were saying, for every dollar we send to Washington, California only gets back a certain percentage, so why should we care? Why should we want to send more dollars to Washington? This will allow us to send less dollars to Washington. We're in fact in favor of that. And so there's a lot of political ramifications in this sense. I might also add that you have some rather prominent Democratic governors right now that are launching political careers of their own, or about to launch political careers of their own, perhaps at the national level. Mark White in Texas, Robert Graham in Florida, certainly Mario Cuomo in New York. We might be able to list a few others. And there are political ramifications to what the Reagan administration is proposing relative to the effect on these states, too. Certainly Texas, for example, which is now experiencing severe problems because of the drop in oil prices, and may have to face a tax increase of some kind because of that circumstance. When you add Gramm-Rudman to it, it becomes a much more difficult situation for the political leadership of the state of Texas.
It would seem that local governments in Indiana, local government officials, are particularly going to be caught in the squeeze here in the cut in federal spending. What you have, particularly in the federal revenue sharing program, were funds that were designed for one-time expenditures. You build your building, you buy your fire truck, but one-time expenditures, don't build them into your budget. But Indiana has, since 1973, either frozen a rate or a levy or controlled the rates of levies of local governments. That is, that put a cap on the amount of new money they can raise. So, consequently, local governments have been building federal revenue sharing funds into their operations budgets for salaries. Is not local government really going to be caught in a pinch on this?
I think they will, and especially in a state like Indiana where there are some severe constraints on the ability of local government to raise their tax. I think if we look at Indiana, we've seen this, the state legislature has been exploring ways now to open that up a little bit through county option taxes, excise taxes of one kind or another to finance this particular improvement, such as the Hoosier Dome, which is... or
the one proposed for Delaware County.
Or the one for Delaware County, if we want to look more locally. And maybe the leaders of state government at both the executive and legislative levels are looking at what's happening in Washington and saying, well, this seems to be something that might affect us, and we may have to think of additional ways of loosening up our own revenue pictures around here in anticipation of that. It's not. I'd like to point out too that may not be an altogether bad thing. If we look at overhead on government programs, the amount of overhead, that is administrative cost, tends to accelerate the farther we go up. Federal programs are the most expensive to administer. Local programs are the least expensive to administer in terms of their own costs of overhead and personnel and things of that nature. I think the president brought that out in his last press conference as well.
But in terms of political liability and accountability, in fact, federal legislators saying, no, we're not going to enact a tax increase, we'll let the state deal with it. And the state legislators say, we're not going to do it, we'll let the local people talk about a local income tax, a local wheel tax, a local hotel motel tax. It's
Tolls
a
on
matter
your highways.
It's a matter of political liability too, isn't it?
That's right.
I think it is, and I think and to a large extent that's very desirable because it makes local legislators and local politicians be directly accountable to the local citizens that have to fund these programs. And I think if anything else, when people talk about what the harm that will be done by Gramm-Rudman, they focus exclusively on these reductions. Actually, they're not total reductions in federal spending on the total level, but they're a reduction in the rate of increase in federal spending. Federal spending every year is going up, and Gramm-Rudman won't change that. It won't decrease total federal spending. It will just reduce the rate of increase. There will be some domestic programs where there will actually be real decreases. But the net effect of this is it means that people, and in general, people always watch over their own expenditures, if it's their money, more carefully than if they're spending someone else's money. And analogy with Gramm-Rudman would be an analogy if you go out with your friends and have dinner, and you have separate checks, what do you order, how much do you pay for? Now you go out with your friends to dinner, and they don't tell you before, but that you're going to split the bill equally. So you order, some people order lobster, some people order chopped steak. The people that ordered chopped steak subsidize the people that ordered lobster. If you knew that the third time you went to dinner, that the check was going to be split equally, what does everyone do? They spend more money because they think someone else will pay for it. Gramm-Rudman's saying, let's put a limit on what everyone can spend so that people will use their money more wisely than they did before.
And the point to be made is that revenue sharing and deficits, to a large measure, are an illusionary form of finance that makes people think that they're getting something for nothing.
Exactly.
Again, I mean, the analogy I talked about earlier, a tax increase. People see a tax increase. People see an expenditure reduction. Who sees what the cost of the deficit is? What share of the deficit does Indiana, if we spend $1 billion at the federal level, what's that cost Indiana if we finance it through the deficit? Well, I don't know. I don't know any professional economist that knows. I think the kind of tax devices that essentially generate these illusions of zero cost are the kinds of things they're trying to get around, and I think quite rightfully so.
All right. Let me ask my two economics friends here if we can sum up the economic effect of this to a certain extent. We seem to be agreed that politically people in Indiana may not like the effect of Gramm-Rudman in the sense that it means fewer federal dollars. At least that might be an initial reaction to it without looking at the fine print of what the implications are. But you seem to be saying that the effect of Gramm-Rudman on the taxpayers of Indiana should be positive. Is that correct?
That's what it would seem to me.
I would say at the margin there are some federal expenditures that are valued less than the cost of those expenditures. Now, if Gramm-Rudman succeeds in reducing those expenditures, which there's no guarantee it will because of its essentially across-the-board nature, then there will be a net benefit because consumers ultimately will have more resources that they can consume in the private sector, fewer that will be consumed by the government sector. If they value their command over resources more than what government directs the same expenditures over the resources, they will benefit from that.
Of course, someone's going to get gored on all this in the sense that just because Indiana on net ends up being ahead by virtue of Gramm-Rudman, it might not mean that public employees in the state of Indiana are ahead because of Gramm-Rudman. And again, if you look at the kinds of people that are complaining about Gramm-Rudman and budget cutbacks and the kind of people that are supporting those budget cutbacks, I think it falls into special interest groups that are very predictable. State and local employees, unions, of course, are saying terrible things are going to happen if we have budget cutbacks. Well, that's what they said in California, and California didn't fall in the ocean, or hasn't yet.
But
certainly not because of Proposition 13.
Our local governments, local government officials, don't they tend to be more stingy than Uncle Sam? I mean,
they do so because they're directly responsible to the voters for spending their money wisely. And people in Washington have found that if they can get pork barrel projects in their district, they can get taxpayers in Indiana to fund some of that. And those taxpayers in Indiana don't vote for the congressman in California where they get water projects. They can actually, through log rolling and vote trading in Congress, they're less stingy with taxpayers' money than your local politicians because they're not accountable to all the citizens that help fund those projects.
It's the Sun Belt that's going to suffer.
Yes. I would hope
Exclusively. Not to mention federal bureaucrats who like to have big offices. I mean, it's obviously going to cut the paperwork, going to cut the staffs of some Washington bureaucracies, is it not?
Oh,
to some
absolutely.
extent?
I would hope that it would reduce the rate of increase in some of the bureaucracy, rather than actual total decreases in the bureaucracy.
Negative growth, like they talk about in defense.
I'd like to see negative growth.
Another political aspect of this is in the sense that sort of the direction of these cuts, too. If Gramm-Rudman mandates cuts of a certain nature in defense, for example, again, the across-the-board idea, then you will have states in the Sun Belt, the South and the West, that will be
Because
out
some
of
states
funds.
are more defense intensive than others.
Absolutely. Georgia, New Mexico, California, you can name several. Much more so than in Indiana, Illinois, or Ohio, for example. And it's important to note that in this case, then you could really see a difference in a much more aggressive effort in Congress to either raise taxes to continue to supply these sorts of things, or to reduce the amount by a certain amount less, because Sun Belt states will be affected not only by cuts in social programs, but they'll also be more adversely affected by cuts in defense.
Well, but in fact, isn't defense more of a federal program in that sense too? Is that sure you can turn over welfare programs to the state, you can turn over certain of social programs, but you can't turn over defense programs to the state. Defense has a built-in minimum, doesn't it?
That's true, but defense contractors exist in states. Defense contractors don't exist at the federal level. Defense contracting always has to be done. And the impact, for example, of stretching out a submarine or a Navy task force program could be considerable, because I think the components for a nuclear submarine, for example, every one of the congressional districts is covered in that. You know, somebody in some congressional district supplies some part that goes into a nuclear submarine.
But your point is that they're concentrated in particular areas.
That's right.
They're concentrated, like Virginia receives a lot more than Indiana does
Absolutely.
from defense in terms
Absolutely.
of jobs.
In terms of just the expenditures,
Just
obviously
expenditure,
Indiana
sure.
benefits if we have MX missiles in Utah. That is, the benefits from defense expenditures are spread at the federal level. And it's a fairly narrow conception of measuring them as just by where are the dollars spent to build the submarines or the missiles.
But politically
or the bombers.
important way.
But they are.
A politically
that is
important
politically
way.
important. But Indiana still benefits when we have a naval base in Norfolk, Virginia.
So Gramm-Rudman isn't all that bad, that's what you're saying.
We have to wait and see.
Bad poison.
Okay.
Perhaps, again, we were learning to
have to
love
wait
it,
and
even
see.
though we hate it.
Okay. So, well, do you believe, do you really believe that Gramm-Rudman then is going to be, if not our savior, at least put us on the road toward some
The road towards salvation?
road
I
toward
don't know.
something? Maybe that's it. Toward accountability.
I think it's definitely on the road towards more rational decision making on federal expenditures.
Okay, fine. We're out of time today. Thanks to our panelists from the Department of Economics, Matthias Mittman and Cecil Bohannon, and from the Department of History, Bruce Galehood. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.